Yeah.
Okay, so then I went to reconnaissance school to learn to be a recon expert, which I eventually became. In 1950, later on, I guess sometime in October, or I don't remember the dates exactly, but it was in later 1950, they sent me to Korea because they sent a group of us reconnaissance people to Korea. We had studied, before we went to Korea, we had studied the terrain on the Manchurian border. North, my particular area was north of the Yalu River, and the Yalu River and the Chosin Reservoir, which was on the up near the Manchurian border between Manchuria and North Korea. And we were, if I remember correctly, at that time we were pretty well beating back the North Koreans and heading towards the Manchurian border. And I think that some of the Chinese had crossed in the 8th Army District in the western portion. I'm not exactly sure of this because I wasn't in a tactical situation as far as command is concerned. I was, and they were unsure as far as I could get my information of whether or not the Chinese were poised on the other side of the border, or whether or not, and if they were, in what strength. Our ways to find them in those days was what they call signal, and we would trace and track the signals of the units, and we hadn't put in place yet the main things that we had at the end of the Second World War, which would be more accurate for tracking the units of the invading army. So they needed a group of recon teams to go and go behind the lines if we could get there and report back as to what we found as divisions and flags, and if we could figure out some types of middle strengths of units and where they were located. And I remember that I went up. I went to Busan, and the weather was terrible, and it was very difficult to get planes up. So they sent a group of us up. Someone up with the Army, and I went up north with the 1st Marine Division. And we ended up, over a period of time, it was really grueling going up there because it was all through, I remember towns like Tokore. I remember those kind of places where that was the end of civilization, because from then on we had to go up into the mountains north, and it was very, very cold. It was like in November, it must have been 40 below zero, or something, with 80 mile an hour or 60 mile an hour winds with like 100. They didn't measure it in the way we do today, but it was very bitter cold and windy, and that interfered with the airplanes, and it interfered with the mechanics, and eventually I think they probably figured it out, but it took a while. So they needed bodies, boots on the ground, behind the line, behind the Manchurian border, to find out what the Chinese were doing. The Chinese had, I later found out, but that's not part of this story because I didn't know it at the time. I later found out that they were minimizing the look of the troop disbursement in North Korea, so that we would not know that they had as many troops in North Korea as they did. And so I went up there, and I'll never forget this night. It was, I don't remember the months exactly, but I think it was in November. And I was blackened and ready to go with my two-man team that I was the third member of, and the other teams were scattered all over the Manchurian border, through the 8th Army, through the 10th Corps, and as I said, I was with the 1st Marine Division. And the night we were supposed to go, we were supposed to leave at 3 a.m. in the morning, and it was very overcast that night, and we were going to go down our side and cross the river. The river was frozen over in most areas, and this was up at the Chosin Reservoir, and go back up the other side and sneak behind the Chinese lines if we could. And I was 16 years old. I told you I had lied about my age, and I was a very bright young kid, so I could get away with it. And about an hour, about an hour before we were supposed to take off and head for the river, we were sitting there, and my buddies were smoking, and I didn't smoke, but we were sitting there and talking and chatting, and all of a sudden we heard bugles. And we had never heard bugles before. I mean, it was eerie because we were in the mountains or up high, and the echo at night, these bugles were echoing all over the mountains, and coming back at us. So it sounded like a lot more bugles than it might have been. And the next thing we knew, they were coming like hordes of ants, like they were just coming. We fired flares in the air. I was with the 1st Marine Division. I wasn't a Marine, I was in the Army, but I was with them. And they fired flares up over the river, and there they were, I don't know, thousands and thousands of them, like ants, coming down and towards us. And I know the Marines, they opened up with everything they had. They had artillery, they had mortars, they had BARs, they had rocket launchers, and machine guns, and small arms. Everything was off at the same time. And we wiped out the first, it took about half an hour, and it was quiet. And there they were, and we fired more flares up, and we could see all the dead, all the Chinese, and some of them were wounded and injured and moaning, but it was deathly quiet. So we thought that we wiped out the Chinese invasion, or the Chinese unit that was attacking us. And we started cheering, all of us. We had almost no casualties at that moment, and we started to cheer, and we were laughing, and went on for about another 10, 15, 20 minutes, and suddenly we hear bugles again. And the same kind of eerie sound, and this time we knew it was coming, and they fired up more flares, and sure enough, here comes a whole second unit, maybe twice the size of the first. And a lot of them had no weapons, and we fired and killed and the ones that remained picked up the weapons of the first group that was laying injured and dead and kept coming. Well, this happened 3 times. After the second group that came down, and we wiped most of them out, some of them fled back, we weren't cheering anymore. We were really scared. And of course at 16 I was too dumb to be scared, but it was all exciting to me. And I remember this big fella, big Marine, in the whole foxhole with me, standing next to me, and he was talking to me, and he was telling me, before the attack, he was telling me about his home in Nebraska, was it? I think it was Nebraska, and his folks, and how he was a farmer, and a big bulk of a man. And that'll come into the story a little later with him, because actually he saved my life. But when the third set of bugles started and resounded across the mountains, it was snowing, I believe, and we had our ammunition was zeroed out. I mean, we had nothing left. Our supplier, MacArthur, had left our supply lines so completely barren because we moved up so fast that he couldn't arrange for our supplies to keep up with the speed that we needed them. So we didn't have the ammo. We really were isolated up there pretty much. Knew nothing about what was going on. Just when you're on a foot soldier on the ground, you only know what's happening within your own radius, and that's all we knew, and it's certainly all I knew. And all of a sudden, they fired up the flares that they had left, and they didn't have many of those. And sure enough, here came the next group, and we had nothing to hit them with anymore. And they came down, and they picked up the weapons of the first group that the second group had, and then they came at us. And somewhere, someplace, I don't even know where, was the order to retreat. Get the hell out of there. We had nothing to fight with, except our bare hands and our rifles and bayonets and a few rounds that we might have had left. And before we could say Jack Robinson, they had come right up there, they were right up to us, and I turned around and I was looking at our guys, and they had turned and they started running. I mean, just like in a mass evacuation, all your eye could see at night, where you couldn't see that much, was guys heading south. I mean, they just took off. And the sergeant came over to me and he said, "We need a little time. Give us some support fire." And he's yelling at a whole group of people that are in the foxholes. And I didn't know from diddle, and suddenly I looked back into where they were coming from, and suddenly in front of me was this. I looked in his face. He couldn't have been older than I was. He had to be 15 or 16 years old. He was Chinese. He was Asian. In those days we called him Oriental. And he was dressed, if I can remember, in padded clothing, padded flaps on his ears, flapped grayish. I just remember him, and the next thing I know, I feel he comes in, and I've had one round left. I fired, and I saw him get hit and go back and fall down, and I had no more rounds. I had nothing, and this fellow next to me, he said, "Let's get out of here," and then he turned and looked at me and said, "Alan, look." And I looked down, and there was this rifle. The bayonet it was in me, and I was bleeding, and the butt of the rifle was on the ground. And I looked up, and that's all I remember. I must have passed out. And from what I was told later on, is this fellow, this man, carried me many miles on his back. He didn't remove the bayonet. He was afraid that if he did that, he told us to other people that if he removed the bayonet, he'd think I would maybe have bled out. But he packed with my wound with ice, and the bayonet had gone right through, so he had to pack it on the back also. And he personally supervised the carrying of me all the way down. I don't know where to. I was unconscious, and I don't know how long a period of time it took. And I knew nothing of what was going on with me with the Chinese or any of the battles or anything. I was totally out, thank God, because I didn't have to remember any of that, and I don't. And suddenly, evidently, he brought me down to an advanced MASH unit station, advanced, whatever. This is what I'm told. And they were afraid to take the bayonet out also, so they wanted to evacuate me. And they had these helicopters, and evidently there was a hospital ship offshore where they were evacuating a lot of the wounded, and there were plenty of us. And according to what I heard, according to what I heard, that they strapped me in a litter onto the strut, the landing strut of one of these helicopters, and they had another person the same way on the other one. And they took off, and I ended up in the hospital ship, all unconscious this whole time. This is all from hearsay. Unfortunately, the fellow, the big guy, the one that saved my life, was killed in the retreat. When and where, I don't know, but from what I'm told, it was just before we got to the mass station, because evidently the Chinese were really, with the 1st Marine Division was really under heavy fire, all the way down. I don't remember anything about the hospital ship. Evidently, they removed, I'm not sure really at this point, whether they removed the bayonet on the hospital ship or whether they then flew me. I ended up in a hospital in Japan. I think it was Kyoto, Japan. In fact, I know it was an American military hospital. And they removed the bayonet. The fellow that saved my life, he had enough good sense to take the scabbard off the belt of the Chinese boy that I killed, that bayoneted me, and he carried that with him all the way down. I really never got to speak to him after the bayoneting, because I told you I was unconscious, so I have no idea what his motivation was in doing that. But when I woke up in the hospital, and the doctors were talking to me, and they were glad that I was alive, and they couldn't believe that I was alive, because the bayonet and their operations, they had to remove my gallbladder and, according to them, half my spleen, and I should have been dead. And he saved my life so I didn't bleed out, by packing these wounds. And all these corpsmen knew, this is also hearsay to me, was that I must have been in severe pain, so they were injecting me with morphine, and lots of it, all the way down. When I got to the MASH station, they put in more morphine. When I got to the hospital ship, they gave me more morphine. When I woke up in the hospital, I had no pain. The doctors had told me this whole thing about why I shouldn't really be alive, and then I was hooked on morphine at 16 years of age. There was a particular nurse in the hospital. She was Japanese, young girl. Took a fancy to me, and I took a fancy to her, and I was in the hospital maybe a month or two, maybe 2 months, and we became very good friends. And she was the one that brought me the bayonet and the scabbard, because when the bayonet was removed, they also had the scabbard, and she brought it to me and said, this is, here it is. And I still have that. I just showed it to Lee, and I showed her a picture that I got off online today of one of the Chinese lying at the Yala River with that same bayonet and same scabbard, kind of scabbard. It turns out it was a German officer's bayonet, because the Chinese were using German weapons, Second World War German weapons, and most of them rifles were Mausers. bolt action Mausers, and they had these bayonets fixed, that you could fix on them. And so this is a German officer's bayonet that was manufactured in Toledo, Spain. I found out in the hospital in Japan that what this fellow did for me, and I found out his name, which I don't want to give right now, and I found out where he lived and where he came from, and it was not Nebraska, it was Kansas, as a matter of fact. And so I stayed in the hospital for as long as I could, and in the hospital, suddenly one day the brass, I guess it was the CIC, came in, or the intelligence, and they found out that I was only 16 years old. And that was really upsetting, because that could have been made a big splash. I was 16 and fighting in Korea, and was drafted because I did push up the draft. And so here I was wounded, here I was recuperating, and they gave me 3 or 4 choices. They wanted to smooth this whole thing over about my underage business. I could be discharged from the Army with an honorable discharge. I could stay in the Army and be stateside and not in combat area. I could be sent over to NATO command in Europe, in Western Europe, probably Germany. Or they gave me an option that I chose. They would put me through university, and when I graduated university, I'd have to go back into the Army for another 2 years, or at least 2 years. And that's the choice that I made. And on the way home, a lot of things happened on the way home, a lot of detours, and I won't go into them. Those are other stories, have to do with Tibet and the Dalai Lama. But when I got back to the United States, I went to Kansas, and I went to visit his parents and his sister on the farm, and it was harvest time on the farm. And his mother and father, they just couldn't get enough of me, and I couldn't get enough of them. And I stayed there, I don't know how many weeks, and helped them harvest their crop. And they became so attached to me, they sort of drifted over as if I were their son, who they just lost, and here they got somebody back again. And so anyway, I was there for a few weeks and relished those few weeks because they were such wonderful people. And then I went home. Now, my parents knew I was in the Army. They never knew I was in Korea. They really never knew where I was in the Army. I just, I had friends at Fort Dick, mailed them postcards. I had made postcards out before I left, I think it was Fort Benning in Georgia. I don't remember where I took the other schools. And remember, it's, 63 years ago. That's a long time. And so they never really knew where I was, and they knew I was in the service, and my mother was, when I first got to Fort Dix, I'll never forget it, the first telephone call I get from her, because it It was raining and it's pouring, and she said, "Are you wearing your rubbers?" I'll never forget that. And here I was in basic training in the Army. Am I wearing my rubbers because I'm a Marine? That was a very important part of my life, because at 16, a lot of molds were set on what I could eat, what I could drink for the rest of my life. And it molded my mind and my psyche, and I was indestructible. At that time, I said I should have been killed. I'm living on borrowed time, so I can do anything I want now and not have fear of dying. And if I do die, so what? It was a totally different perspective. And I was only 16. But that followed me through my whole life. It followed me completely through university. It followed me through my Army career after that, and through my business career after that, and through everything up to the present day. It's really been the experience that is my core beliefs. It was very interesting. It was very surreal to me today. There were an awful lot of things that I did and didn't do because of those experiences that I had in Korea. It never came out to my parents. They never knew I was in Korea. They never found out about, well, my sister or anybody ever found out about my wound. I still have a major scar in my chest and in my back. The one thing that I had to tell you, that when I was hooked on morphine, and that I had this young nurse as my dear friend. She was only she had to be 19, maybe 20 years old. I was 16. In the hospital in Japan. They knew very little back in 1950 about drugs and about drugs as we know today. And the Army used morphine like it was, we had so many wounded and so many injured and so many in pain, they just used morphine like it was water.